everyone, and welcome to another episode of Coast Connections. We're coming to you from the traditional territory of the Nanaimo-Sunamuk First Nation and also the chosen home of the Mid-Island Métis Nation. We're here today with Canada's current #1 best-selling author, Elinor Florence. She's a friend of Coast Connections. She's been here before, you might recognize her, and her book currently is at the top of the charts. Welcome, Elinor.
Thank you for having me again.
Again, welcome back to Coast Connections, my friend. And you're riding a really high wave right now, Elinor. Congratulations on this beautiful book that you've written, Finding Flora. And we've added a little flora to the set to
Perfect.
Beautiful book. It's all about homesteading on the Canadian prairie during the late 1800s all the way up till about 1930. This is such a good book on so many levels. It's a rollicking mystery. There's a very entangled love story in this. It's also a love story to the prairies. You can
Indeed.
tell that you are from that area because of the beautiful way that you describe the prairies and everything. So I just wanted to tell you that it was an enthralling read and I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Now, Elinor, Homesteading 101, I'm sure a lot of people watching don't really know about this, the Dominion of Canada and the Homesteading Act.
You're right. Since the book came out on April 1st, I've been traveling around Western Canada doing book events. And quite often when I'm telling people about the book, I will say, do you know what a homestead was? And most will say yes, although I'm not sure they really know. And some will say, no, I don't know. So our country was formed in 1867. And in 1870, the Hudson Bay Company, which at that time owned 30% of the landmass of Canada, turned over all its land to the new Dominion government, and they opened up the West for settlers. And they passed the Homestead Act in 1872, and it lasted until 1930. And what that meant was they gave away free land, 160 acres of free land, to anybody who could move onto the property and meet some very stringent conditions. They had to build a habitable dwelling, they had to live in it for 3 years, and they had to cultivate a certain number of acres, 5 acres the first year, 10 the second, 15 the third. And the government then proceeded to do something which I consider to be practically criminal. They mounted this huge propaganda campaign in the United Kingdom and Europe, telling people that this place was a Garden of Eden. And all they had to do was come over here and start growing their crops and life would be great. Mm-hmm. Well, of course, the reality was much different.
Mm-hmm. They were hoodwinked. Yeah, and they came over here with great expectations, only to find out that they were going to be in a living hell because they didn't have the skills, they didn't have the equipment, they didn't have the survival or the connections to actually make this work. So I think it was about a 50% failure rate, wasn't it, Elinor, of those who tried to settle the land?
Yes, and you have to remember they had no clue. I mean, there were no photographs of this area of the prairies. There was no media. So they absolutely had to rely on what the government of Canada was telling them. And when they get off the train, they'd have to buy their supplies, go find the iron stake in the ground, which had their land description on it before they even knew where their land was, and start trying to carve out a life for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Now, this was open to all people, but mostly men. There was some women that were allowed to get title to the land, but it was a very, very, very misogynist homesteading act, wasn't it?
It certainly was. The Minister of the Interior at the time, Frank Oliver, was living in Edmonton. He was the owner of the first newspaper in Alberta, the Edmonton Bulletin. At the time, it wasn't even Alberta, it was the Northwest Territories, because Alberta and Saskatchewan didn't become provinces until September 1st, 1905. And he did not want women homesteading. So when I started researching my book, I was so taken aback to find that single women in Canada were never allowed to claim a free homestead. south of the border, they were. The American government was much more open-minded, and thousands of single women claimed homesteads in Montana and other states. But up here, they were not allowed to. The only exception was, and this seems counterintuitive, were widows with children. They were considered the heads of households.
Mm-hmm. And that fits the profile of my own great-grandmother, who came over as a young widow from Bessarabia at the time with 3 little boys, ended up on the prairie near Hilda, Alberta, and spent their first winter in a dugout made of sod. And they almost died. They did not have any of these skills that were needed. That first winter was tragic. Yeah.
Yes, if you had a little bit of money when you arrived, you could afford to buy things to make your life more comfortable and hire people to help you. But if you arrived with only, your personal possessions, it was grim. And I believe the reason that they didn't want single women to homestead is that they wanted single white women to marry men and produce white children. That was the idea. They wanted to populate Western Canada with whites. So preferably from the United Kingdom, because they were already British subjects. But then they kind of opened it up to Europe. So as your family, they weren't considered quite the same level as the Brits.
That's true.
But at least they were white,
yeah.
And that was the main thing.
Isn't that awful?
Yeah, terrible.
Absolutely. And your main character in your book is based on your own Scottish ancestry and your own Indigenous ancestry as well, isn't it, Elinor?
Somewhat, yes. My grandparents homesteaded. They were from Scotland on one side of my family, and on the other side of my family, my ancestors came from Scotland as well and married Indigenous women and worked for the Hudson Bay Company. So there is a Métis woman in my book, and just as a nod to my own great-grandmother, I named her Jessie MacDonald, which was my great-grandmother's name.
Mm-hmm. And you also dedicated the book to her, which
yes.
is very lovely as well. Yeah. That the homesteading, the whole experiment or program, it also almost sounds like the original reality show. 30 acres over 3 years was the challenge, and then it's yours, then we'll give you title to it. There's some of these reality shows like Alone and Survival, but these people were living it. This was their life. They were living it with little children, alone, dislocated from their own countries. It would just have been horrific for these ladies.
The isolation was incredible. And William Van Horn, the president of the Canadian Pacific Railway, actually didn't want the prairies to be surveyed in square mile sections the way it was. He thought that they would be better off to do it the European way and have the communities, villages form, and then the land come out in a spoke-like fashion the way they do in Europe. And that way everybody could live together and help each other. But the government chose instead to survey the whole property in 1 square mile sections. And then they divided those sections into 4, which was 160 acres. So that's why you hear people referring to a quarter or a quarter section. That was their 160 acres.
Yeah, wow. So tell us about the book, Finding Flora. How did you come up with that title?
Well, I actually gave my publisher a short list of titles to choose from. The publisher has a lot of input, and the publisher also chose the cover. And when I first saw the cover, I thought, gee, that doesn't really scream homesteading, but it's such a pretty cover with the green fields that, people really love that cover. Mm-hmm. Flora Craigie was just a name that I made up. I was looking for a Scottish name, something easy to pronounce and easy to read.
Mm-hmm. For me, the title of Finding Flora, there was a few people looking for Flora.
Yeah.
Flora was finding herself, and Flora was also finding flora growing on the prairie.
Very good. You got all 3 references. Great.
So I thought the title was very apropos.
Right.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Elinor, this book has had great success across the country, coast to coast to coast. And I think it's with this new insurgence of patriotism, perhaps. But how have your readers been responding while you're out there promoting your new book?
Oh gosh, I've had so many lovely emails and messages, even phone calls from people who love the book. And as you said, I think it's really important to shop Canadian right now. I love supporting Canadian bookstores, independent bookstores. We're very lucky here on Vancouver Island because there are probably half a dozen independent bookstores between here and, Comox. And as well, Indigo Coles Chapters, that's one chain that's all owned by the same Canadian company. So that is a Canadian chain. So if anybody's looking to support Canadian authors and bookstores, I urge you to order your book from one of those places. And as well, I think people are tired of maybe just now reading very dark, disturbing fiction, and mine is more uplifting. I mean, bad things happen in it, but everything, I shouldn't really give too much away, should I? Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert.
Everything works out in the end.
Yeah, exactly. This is so well researched too, Elinor. Your bibliography, I think, has about 30 or 35 books or references that readers can go and dig deeper into this topic. So it may be historical fiction, but it certainly is based on fact and gives a very realistic picture of what happened there during the homesteaders. And particularly for women, this was very, very brutal. And other women, too, were very opposed to women becoming homesteaders on the prairie as well.
Yes, well, you have to remember that at that time, it wasn't just homesteaders, but women had no rights whatsoever. They did not have a vote. They were not even considered persons in the eyes of the law until 1929. So they were completely helpless and dependent on men, and you couldn't really get divorced, and certainly if you left your husband, you would leave with nothing. So it was a grim time for women. Interestingly, though, it was women on the prairies who got the vote first in Canada, and that was due to their husbands, because their husbands realized, we don't have a big voice in Ottawa, but if we had 2 votes per household instead of 1, that would be helpful.
Women came in useful.
They did.
Oh.
They obviously assumed their wives would vote the same way as they did, which may not have been the case. We don't know.
No.
But women on the prairies did get the vote in 1916, and they were the first in Canada to do so.
Oh, good to know. Now, in the book, you have wonderful descriptions of all types of things, like the weather. You can see, hear, feel, breathe in all 4 seasons during this book, and the blood, sweat, and tears that went into every season as they survived. But what really struck me is these women were not prepared to be doing this hard labor. They were in blouses like yours, not called a blouse then. They just did not have the clothing to be doing this. It was staggering what they had to deal with.
Yes, if you can imagine doing that kind of physical labor in a long skirt. Women in those days had almost like a uniform. They had long, dark skirts and high-necked blouses like this one with long sleeves called shirt waists. And usually they had several shirtwaists, cotton shirtwaists in different colors, maybe pinstriped or whatever. But one thing that they all shared in common was the big hats. So,
Elinor, you
yes,
brought your big hat.
I do. So this was a pretty inexpensive way to dress up, actually, because you would have, a basic hat, and then you would decorate it however you wanted, and you could change it with the seasons. And in summer, you could even put flowers from the garden on your hat. So it was very inexpensive. So, but that was definitely the style. And the more elaborate the hat, the wealthy you were.
Yeah. Depending on the number of flowers you could find, and wheat sheaves and things. Yeah. Now, in the book, some of these enormous skills that these ladies had to learn, like really, really quickly, like chinking the inside of their shack using horse manure, creek mud, and water, and like really for insulation.
Yeah, well, the first thing they had to do was build a dwelling of some kind. And like was it your great-grandmother?
Yeah, Justine.
Sometimes it was no more than a hole in the ground. If they had some money, they could afford to buy milled lumber and have somebody build them a shack. Usually it was just an 8 by 10 or 10 by 12 shack because they had to keep it warm in the winter, and they didn't want a big dwelling to try to keep warm in. If they didn't have enough money to buy milled lumber, and they had bush on their property, they would cut down trees and build a log house. And if they had neither of those things, they would cut blocks of earth, like building a snow fort, and pile them up and make a sod shack called a soddy. And there's still a couple of those around on the prairies today. You have to remember, this is such recent history that we're talking about. It seems like ancient history, but really it's only 2 generations. I mean, my own grandparents were born in the 1800s, which is interesting when you think about it.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And these are women who've never ridden a horse. They had to acquire a horse. They had to learn how to ride it, how to bridle, how to, get a team of horses together to do the work, how to plow the fields. I mean, these are mad skills that you would never have needed back in Aberdeen, Scotland. And yet here you are on the Canadian prairie, you learn or you die.
Yes, they had to feed themselves too. And if they didn't have a lot of money, they would buy their basic supplies at whatever general store was near. Usually it was 1 or 2 days' journey away to get a sack of flour and sugar. So then the first thing they did was, if they arrived in the spring, they were more fortunate because they could plant a garden and hopefully harvest some vegetables by the fall. But many of them had never used a firearm before. So it's okay to say, well, they can, there's lots of game, but you have to know what you're doing. You can't just pick up a gun and shoot something. And then you have to learn how to skin it, preserve the meat. I mean, the meat had to be treated immediately because they didn't have freezers. So it had to be smoked or boiled and salted immediately. And yes, I think that there was much suffering, death from accidents and illnesses from people who didn't know what they were doing. If you did have some helpful neighbors, that made all the difference, of course.
And in your book, there is a circle of helpful neighbors who were all sort of suffering the same type of isolation and dislocation that Flora was. And that sense of community that was starting to build there in your story is so heartwarming and so beautiful, and the type of connections that we still need to this day. And that was a lovely element to your story, Elinor. I just loved that. And 2 of the women were in what they called a Boston marriage. Tell us about that.
Well, that was an expression that did originate in Boston, and it was when 2 single women set up house together. Now, in those days, women didn't make as much money as men, so sometimes it was just a financial arrangement. It made more sense for women to live together and maintain a household together. In other cases, they were gay, but we don't know that. But 2 women living together were considered to be in a Boston marriage. And in my book, 2 of the women who live in the same area as Flora are living together.
And you have a Métis lady living in the same area as well, who was fiercely helpful to the other women.
Yes, and that's something, again, learning skills. We don't talk very much about how helpful the Indigenous people were to the white settlers. In many cases, they taught them what to do and what to look for and how to hunt, and even brought food to them when they were starving. And I don't know why that hasn't really come up a lot in our recent Truth and Reconciliation discussions, but in many cases they survived because of the Indigenous people.
Yes, yes. And one of the things that I really liked about your book too is that you mentioned it was also reviewed by an Indigenous professor for sensitivity in the book, because we're in a different time now. Looking back on that era, we don't want to sound like we're using the wrong terms. So tell me a little bit about that. I thought that was a really nice touch.
Yes, there are people now called sensitivity editors, and they will read your manuscript and tell you if you've gone wrong anywhere. And mine was named Rhonda Chronic in Edmonton, and she did pick up on a few things. I think I had my Métis woman wearing mucklucks in winter, and she said, no, that's an Inuit, form of footwear. She would have been wearing moccasins. And yeah, a couple of things like that were quite helpful. Thankfully she didn't have too much to complain about.
Yeah, exactly. The weather is a character in your book as well. Tell us about some of the hailstorms that these poor homesteaders had to put up with, and winters.
Well, I grew up on a farm in Saskatchewan, so I didn't have to research that part too heavily, because, obviously I grew up in a family that was very sensitive to the changes in the weather, and spent a lot of time standing out in the yard looking at the sky, wondering what it was going to do. So, yes, not only the brutal cold, which they had no comprehension of, and why would they? Yeah. But the terrible hailstorms, lightning strikes, prairie fires, floods not so much, although speaking of water, the importance of having fresh water on your property or a source of drinking water was also almost a life or death situation.
One of the things, not only putting on your bonnet to go out, to town, but also, if you wanted to look sort of half decent, you'd like to look in a mirror every now and then, wouldn't you? Tell us what they used for a mirror.
Well, if you were lucky, you'd have a pocket mirror of some kind. I actually have a little mirror that they issued to World War I soldiers, so they'd be able to shave. It's a little thing like that that my grandfather had, but otherwise, you'd look in a saucepan or a spoon or a pool of water, whatever reflected your face.
Or a knife blade.
A knife.
Yeah. Unreal. How did they do laundry? I mean, you're out there sweating, you're muddy. How do you get the laundry done?
Well, I don't think they were very clean. In winter, I expect they probably slept in their clothes and wore them 24/7, but you would have to haul water, build a fire in your wood stove, heat it, numerous times to wash and rinse your clothing and hang it outside on the clothesline. And in winter, you'd have to melt snow to do the same thing.
And how would it ever dry in the winter? I mean, you'd probably have to wait for spring.
Maybe.
One of the characters in your book, one of the men, he tied his clothing to a stick and just stuck it in the creek.
Yes.
Let the creek wash it.
Again, I read about 40 pioneer memoirs, I think, before I wrote my book, and I'm pretty sure that was one of the little tidbits that I picked up from, the history books. They don't really give you the day-to-day details of what it was like. And I particularly like to read memoirs by women if I could find them, because they have a completely different attitude. The men, they usually talk about, weather, crops, machinery, horses, but the women are talking about what it's like trying to get your bread to bake in a wood stove, and more of the day-to-day challenges.
And one of the most deadly or dangerous things about being a homesteader was the infant mortality rate, wasn't it, Elinor?
Oh, that was very tragic, terrible. Almost every family lost a baby or a young child, and some of them multiple young children. if typhoid swept through the community or some other fatal illness. And medical help was few and far between, even if they did have the appropriate medication at the time, which they probably didn't. Yeah. And I sometimes wonder how women endured that level of pain and grief and went on, but they did.
They did. There was also a term they used called prairie woman syndrome, where they actually end up in the what they called the mental institute there in Ponoka, Alberta, for women that had lost it. Yeah.
That applied to both men and women, of course. Yeah. It just resulted from the long, lonely months of isolation in which people literally went insane.
Mm-hmm. But Flora didn't go insane,
no.
And neither did her neighbors. And I love how you tie the story into, political activism, and these women kicked butt. In the end, they weren't hoodwinked. Well, they were, but they did triumph. And also that sort of, one of the members of your characters in your book was one of the famous five, who were one of the suffragettes here in Canada and fought for rights for women and children. So, yeah, I thought the character Nellie was going to be Nellie McClung.
Oh,
yeah.
I did read Nellie McClung's autobiography. Yeah. So
your character in here, her name is Irene.
Irene Parlby was a real person.
Yes.
And she's one of the reasons that I chose the location of Alex, Alberta for my book, which most people have never heard of because it's a little tiny village east of Lacombe. Lacombe is about halfway between Calgary and Edmonton, so it's in central Alberta.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Irene Parlby was a rancher's wife from Alex.
There you go. All this Canadian history, it's just so beautiful to read, and the way you've made it so readable, Elinor. It's a story of triumph, it's a story of tragedy, but it's a really heartwarming story. How do you feel about it now that it's published? Simon & Schuster Canada is your publisher, and we have about a minute here to wrap up.
Well, I'm absolutely thrilled, of course. It debuted the first week it was released in the #1 spot for Canadian fiction, which was absolutely staggering. What it means to be a bestseller, for those of you who don't know, it means that every 7 days, all the sales statistics are compiled from every bookstore in Canada, and then they just list the top 10 selling books that week. So that week, my book sold more copies than any other fiction book in Canada.
And you held that record for 7 or 8 weeks. So
I was in the top 10 for 7 weeks, yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Elinor, any closing thoughts before we have to wrap up here today?
Well, I think I really wanted to write a book about homesteading because our history is gradually being forgotten, and homesteaders really did lay the foundation for the Western Canada that we know and love today, and I wanted people to remember them.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've done a beautiful job of that. Thank you so much, Elinor.
Thank you.
Great to see you again, and every success with this new book. I hope everybody gets a chance to read it. It would make a wonderful gift for anybody. Anybody anywhere would enjoy this book, and it talks so much about our shared history in a very, very readable format. Thanks for joining us today. Go out, get the book, check Elinor's website, elinorflorence.com. She's at event signings all around Western Canada, and go out and meet Elinor for yourself. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on Coast Connections.